So, when we talk about types of language knowledge, and I think this is something that is particularly pertinent to Greek and Hebrew, because when I say something like I know Greek, I would actually oftentimes mean something different by that than I know French,
Right.
right? Which is very odd.
Hmm.
But, today people, if they say I know Greek and then you ask them to start speaking it, they would almost certainly say, "Oh, I don't know it like that." Right?
Right.
But
Right.
if you said I know French and they asked you to start speaking it, they would expect you to speak, right?
Right.
And
Right.
again, it's not speaking being the only thing, but just to point out that people actually mean something different when they
Yes.
say, I know a biblical language versus I know another language. So, with that as the background, what is the distinction between explicit and implicit knowledge of a language?
Right. And we often talk about the difference between acquisition and learning. Like you learn about the language in terms of the Greek, but we're expected to acquire French. And
Right.
so SLA and kind of the purpose of this book is under the premise that if you acquire and gain that implicit knowledge, you're going to be further ahead than people who just know about it. So the difference is the implicit knowledge is more unconscious, more intuitive. It's procedural knowledge. In other words, you can use it, you can do something with it, not just read it, but you can write it, you can speak it, you can hear it and understand it. And when you go to use it, you're editing your language output more by feel rather than by rules or paradigms. You just know that's how you say it in the language. And so you understand the knowledge. So that's implicit and more of your French example. But explicit knowledge is more of the conscious knowledge. It's the rules and the paradigms, it's formalized. It's something like you can speak and tell us what the rules are. Whereas with French, you may not know what the rules are. You just know that's how you say it in the language. It's automatized. But in explicit knowledge, you know the rules, you can articulate the rules. And if you're going to use the language, you're using your conscious knowledge to say, okay, now I need a first person singular, whatever it is to get it out rather than just, I know how to say it and here it is. That's kind of the difference between implicit and explicit.
Yeah, and I think to your point, you don't need to know one to do the other or vice versa. It's in
Right.
fact most English speakers, like if you start asking them explicit knowledge grammar questions,
No
they
idea.
yeah, they have no idea. I always ask people what the passive participle break is, and every now and then someone will get it right. But it's like it's the kind of thing where people don't understand that all of the ways that we use language is really inside of us in a way that is different than what we talk about in Greek class or Hebrew class. And I think part of this too is that people often haven't learned a second language in this way or acquired a second language. And because of that, the assumption is that to acquire a second language, I learn a rule instead of I learn to use it in the same way that I use my first language. So one natural question from this, and I know that this is debated in the literature, but I would like to hear your opinion on it and why, is can explicit knowledge become implicit? So particularly here, I'm thinking like if I learn rules,
Mhm.
for the Catal form in
Right,
whatever,
right.
paradigm you want to give me, does that transfer to my ability to read the text? And then at the end of the day, the ability to read the text falls into the implicit knowledge category to
Right.
use the language in a certain way. So does that help me when I'm reading?
I would say yes, but in a very limited way. Now, if we go back to creation and some of these purists, they're going to say, no, absolutely not. There's no connection. You can't learn explicit and it magically turns into implicit. But I think it can have a limited positive function in that it gives you what you need to read the text. And the more you read, the more you're going to gain implicit knowledge of the language. And so it gives you an inroad, but it's not going to just magically turn into implicit knowledge. You have to use it. You've got to do, if nothing else, read a lot to make that happen.
Well, I think that's a really important point is that it is the inroad, but it's not like if you only have that, it doesn't mean you can read. In fact, you can't read, right?
Right.
Like that's it's
Right.
not enough. And it's something that you mentioned Crash and saying no. And I think part of this too is in the SLA literature, the debate on second language acquisition versus first language acquisition, those who tend to think that second language acquisition should be identical or closer in form to first language acquisition, I think would tend to answer this question no, because kids don't learn the rules, right? Kids
Right.
never explicitly learn whatever paradigm it is. But we're not kids, right?
Right.
And what I always tell people too is like, well, my 1-year-old, he's just now starting to speak. He's 13, 14 months. But it's taken him that long, and he can say, bah for bath, or ball for ball. It's like, okay, like I don't want to be that slow, and of course there's like, other reasons for that. But just to point out that like it's not the same thing, right? Because we
Right.
are actually at we have different cognitive capacities at 32 years old. I do than my 1-year-old. And so I can actually see a paradigm and make explicit knowledge from that paradigm, right? And that's
Yes.
not something that he can do.
Right. And we have a capacity for understanding symbols and writing that kids have to grow into and learn. And so that's just going to be faster and different than learning your first language.
Right, right. But to your point, if you don't use that knowledge implicitly, it will never become implicit, right? I
Right.
mean,
Right. Right.
that's
Exactly.
the issue. So in your opinion then, what should the role of explicit knowledge of the grammar be in the classroom, specifically for the biblical languages? So I'm asking this too, thinking about the different ways that the biblical languages are used outside of just reading.
Right.
So in commentaries and whatever, are the biblical languages special in the sense that we talk about the grammar a lot, and how should that factor into the
Yes.
language?
Yes, absolutely. And if for no other reason than the fact that the resources use the meta language, they use the grammar terms to talk about the language, we need to have some grammar instruction. They're not going to be able to access the tools if they don't have some grammar. That's not the ideal way to get to acquisition, but it's necessary for where we are right now. But at the same time, there is a value for learning grammar in that it's the refining and the accuracy that it brings to our understanding of the language. If you focus just on implicit acquisition, you're going to be very good and fluent at being able to read and write, listen, speak, but you may not be accurate. You may miss some of the details if you haven't got at least a little bit of grammar to focus and go, oh, that's why we do it that way, or whatever, or you miss this ending, even though you're communicating and it makes sense, but you need at least a little focus on grammar to get it precise.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because one of the other things I think of is like, I mean, part of precision is research, right?
Mhm.
Like if I'm going to research a certain word or grammatical form, I have to both be accurate about the meaning and then also precisely describe it. And that's the kind of thing where I can't write a journal article and say, well, I know the language really well, and this is my intuition. I have to have a grammatical reason, you
Right,
know, for this interpretation rather than the other, when two interpreters disagree, right? Which
yeah,
happens all the time.
right,
um,
right.
so yeah, I like that about accuracy